Hello everyone. Welcome back to Shadow Storyteller. Before we begin tonight's tale, don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment if you enjoy these bedtime stories. Your support helps this channel grow, and it also lets me know you'd like to hear more strange, mysterious, and chilling encounters before you drift off to sleep. Now, let me take you into a story that still lingers in the minds of those who experienced it. The woman who knocked on our door in New Orleans. It was late September of 2018 when Thomas and his wife, Eleanor, traveled from Manchester to New Orleans for a week-long holiday. They had chosen a small Victorian guest house on Dauphine Street, just a short walk from the French Quarter. The building itself had a weathered charm, paint peeling slightly at the shutters, a wrought iron balcony overlooking the street, and creaking wooden floors that seemed to whisper with every step. On their third night, a humid Tuesday evening, the city outside was alive with jazz drifting from nearby bars, and the faint smell of fried beignets mixed with the damp air that clung to the walls. The rain had passed only an hour earlier, leaving the pavements glistening under the glow of street lamps. It was nearly midnight when the knock came. At first, it was soft, almost hesitant. Just 3 gentle taps against the wooden door of their room on the second floor. Thomas, who had been reading while Eleanor prepared for bed, frowned and looked up from his book. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Eleanor nodded, wrapping her dressing gown tighter around herself. "It must be one of the other guests. Maybe they've mistaken our room?" But then the knock came again. This time louder, steadier. Thomas set his book aside, walked across the room, and placed his hand on the brass handle. Something about the rhythm of the knock unsettled him. It wasn't frantic, nor was it casual. It felt deliberate, measured, almost as if whoever was outside knew they were being listened to. He pulled the door open just slightly. Standing in the hallway was a woman. She looked to be in her mid-30s, her dark hair slick with rain, clinging to her pale face. Her dress was damp, clinging to her frame, and she held her hands folded in front of her as though she had been waiting patiently. "Good evening," she said softly, her accent faint but unmistakably English. "I'm terribly sorry to disturb you. May I come in?" Thomas froze. Something about her calm expression in contrast with the hour, and her soaked condition unsettled him further. Behind him, Eleanor called out nervously, "Who is it?" The woman's eyes flickered towards Eleanor's voice, and she smiled faintly. "Please," she said again. "It's important." The hallway was silent except for the distant creak of the old house and the faint murmur of music still carrying from Bourbon Street. Thomas hesitated. Guests weren't supposed to knock on other guests' doors at such an hour. He felt a chill crawl across his skin, despite the warm dampness of the night. Something in her gaze seemed both pleading and hollow. "Are you staying here?" Thomas asked carefully, keeping the door half closed. Her lips curved into a slow smile. "Not exactly." And then, before Thomas could reply, the sound of another door opening further down the hall made him glance away for just a second. When his eyes returned to the woman, she was gone. No footsteps, no fading echo of movement. Just the stillness of the corridor stretching in both directions. Thomas shut the door quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. Eleanor stared at him, pale-faced. "Who was it?" she whispered. He swallowed, struggling for words. I don't know. She was there, and then she wasn't." Eleanor's eyes widened. She pulled the curtains tighter over the rain-streaked window, as if to keep the night at bay. That was only the beginning of what they would experience in that guest house. The silence inside the room pressed against Thomas and Eleanor like a weight. The faint sound of jazz outside seemed far away now, muffled by the heavy drapes and the strange tension filling their space. Thomas rubbed his arms, goosebumps rising despite the sticky warmth of the New Orleans night. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, her face pale and drawn. "You said she was standing right there?" she asked, her voice hushed, as if speaking too loudly might invite the woman back. Thomas nodded slowly, his throat dry. "Yes, dark hair, soaked through from the rain. She looked directly at me, Eleanor. She asked to come inside, and then she was gone, just gone." Eleanor shuddered, pulling her robe tighter. She was not easily spooked, yet something about the encounter unsettled her to the core. "Maybe she went down the hallway quickly, and you didn't notice?" "No," Thomas said firmly. The corridor was silent. No footsteps, no movement. I looked away for less than a second. When I looked back, there was nothing. The grandfather clock in the lounge below struck midnight, the sound echoing faintly through the floorboards. Each chime seemed to stretch, as though the old house itself was marking the moment. They decided not to open the door again that night. Thomas locked it firmly, tested the handle twice, and left the chain across. Eleanor lay beside him in bed, wide awake, while the humid air clung to their skin. They drifted in and out of restless sleep, disturbed by faint creaks and the occasional sound of distant footsteps on the stairs. Though when Thomas peered out, the hallway remained empty. The next morning, they joined the other guests for breakfast in the downstairs dining room. The owner of the guest house, Mrs. Landry, a warm woman in her 60s with silver hair pinned neatly back, moved about the room, pouring coffee and offering warm croissants. "You both look as if you hardly slept," she remarked kindly, setting down their plates. Eleanor hesitated before replying, glancing at Thomas. He gave a faint shake of his head, as if warning her not to mention it. But Eleanor pressed on. "We thought someone knocked on our door last night. A woman. She asked to come in." Mrs. Landry froze, the coffee pot in her hand tilting just slightly before she set it down with care. Her expression softened, though her eyes seemed to darken with something unsaid. "A woman, you say?" "Yes," Thomas answered, curious now at the flicker of recognition in the owner's face. Dark hair, pale, soaking wet from the rain. English accent. "Do you know her?" Mrs. Landry pressed her lips together for a moment. Then she smiled, though it felt forced. "Ah, perhaps one of the neighbors confused the doors. It happens. These old houses can be disorienting." Thomas wanted to push further, but Eleanor reached for his hand under the table, squeezing it gently. Mrs. Landry moved on to attend to another guest, leaving the couple exchanging uneasy glances. Later that afternoon, they decided to walk through the French Quarter, trying to shake the unease of the night before. The streets were lively, filled with musicians, street performers, and the scent of Cajun cooking wafting from small restaurants. They spent hours wandering, yet the memory of the soaked woman lingered. At times, Eleanor swore she saw a figure just ahead of them in the crowd. Dark hair, slender frame, always slipping away before she could be sure. That evening, after dinner, they returned to the guest house. The air felt heavy again, as if the house held secrets behind its faded wallpaper and creaking beams. Thomas checked the hallway carefully before locking their door. They tried to convince themselves it was all imagination, fueled by fatigue and the strangeness of travel. But then, as the clock neared midnight again, the knock returned. 3 measured taps. Exactly the same as before. Eleanor clutched Thomas's arm. "Don't open it," she whispered urgently. Thomas hesitated, his heart pounding. What if it's another guest in trouble? Last night, she disappeared, Tom. People don't vanish like that. This isn't right. The knock came again, firmer this time, and then a voice, the same soft English accent. "Please let me in. I'm cold." Thomas's skin prickled. Eleanor shook her head violently, pulling the blankets up as if they could shield her. Thomas stayed frozen, his hand hovering near the handle. After a long silence, the voice spoke once more, quieter now. "You shouldn't be here. Not in this room." Then, just like the night before, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. But when Thomas finally pulled open the door, the corridor was empty. They hardly slept that night, lying awake until dawn painted the room in pale gold. By morning, Thomas's patience was gone. Over breakfast, when Mrs. Landry passed by again, he leaned forward. "There's something you're not telling us," he said firmly. "Who is the woman? What happened in that house?" Mrs. Landry's smile faltered. She glanced around the room, making sure no other guests were listening. Then she leaned in closer, her voice lowered to a near whisper. "This house has history," she said carefully. "Back in the 1920s, it was a boarding house. There was a young woman from England who lived here. She came to a tragic end." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "What happened to her?" Mrs. Landry shook her head slightly. "It isn't something I speak of often. Some say her spirit still wanders these halls, knocking on doors, asking to be let inside. Always soaked from the rain. They say she drowned in a storm." Thomas felt the air grow colder, despite the morning sun streaming through the windows. Eleanor pressed her hand to her mouth. "Her name," Mrs. Landry whispered, "was Margaret." That night, Thomas and Eleanor prepared for the inevitable. They lit the bedside lamp, kept their shoes by the door, and waited. Neither spoke much. The tension between them was thick, a silence heavier than words. As the hour struck midnight once more, the knock came again. This time, Thomas stood immediately, determination in his stride. Eleanor whispered frantically, begging him not to. But he reached the door and pulled it wide open. There she was, Margaret. Her hair clung to her face, her skin pale against the flickering light of the hallway lamp. She looked directly at Thomas with sorrowful eyes, and her lips trembled as she spoke. "You don't belong here," she whispered. "Leave before it's too late." Eleanor gasped, covering her mouth. Thomas, frozen in place, could only stare as water dripped onto the wooden floorboards beneath her, pooling slowly. The hallway around her seemed darker than before, shadows pressing close. "Too late for what?" Thomas managed to ask, his voice barely a breath. Margaret only shook her head, and then, like mist dispersing, she faded before their eyes, leaving behind nothing but the damp stains on the wood. Eleanor grabbed Thomas's arm, her body trembling. "We need to leave this place," she whispered fiercely. But something told them both that leaving might not be as simple as packing their bags. For the house itself seemed to be watching, and the story of Margaret was not yet done with them. The night after Margaret's warning left Thomas and Eleanor deeply unsettled. They sat awake until the first light of morning filtered through the curtains, the pale yellow glow cutting across the patterned wallpaper like fragile hope. Neither of them spoke much during breakfast. Their hands trembled slightly as they sipped their coffee, and the other guests, blissfully unaware, chatted about sightseeing tours, swamp excursions, and jazz clubs. Thomas kept glancing toward the staircase that led to the upper floors, half expecting to see Margaret's figure lingering there. Eleanor avoided the hallway altogether, refusing to leave their table until it was time to return to their room. Later that day, they decided they could not simply sit and wait for the next midnight. Thomas suggested a walk, something that might distract them from the heavy air of the guest house. The city outside, with its bright facades, wrought iron balconies, and lively chatter, was a world apart from the suffocating atmosphere of Dauphine Street. They wandered down Royal Street, pausing to admire street painters and musicians. Eleanor tried to lose herself in the rhythm of jazz, in the sight of children chasing bubbles in the square. But every time a shadow passed in the corner of her eye, she flinched. She told Thomas she kept thinking she saw Margaret among the crowd, her wet dress clinging to her skin, her dark hair plastered to her face. Thomas grew more determined to find answers. That afternoon, instead of returning directly to the guest house, he brought Eleanor to a small bookstore that specialized in local history. Dusty shelves leaned with weight, and the scent of old paper filled the air. The owner, a thin man named Daniel with spectacles perched on his nose, listened carefully as Thomas asked about unusual deaths connected to their guest house. Daniel's eyes narrowed. He leaned back, tapping a finger on his desk. "The Dauphine boarding house," he murmured. "Yes, I've heard of it. There was a young woman, Margaret Holloway, came from London in the early 20s. She worked as a seamstress, lived alone. Some say she was waiting for her fiancé who never arrived. Others say she was fleeing from something back home." "What happened to her?" Eleanor asked, her voice almost breaking. Daniel lowered his tone. "One night, during a terrible storm, she vanished. The story goes she was last seen standing by the river, in her dress and shoes, despite the floodwaters rising. They found her drowned the next morning. Some claim she wasn't alone, that someone was with her, but no one ever proved anything." Eleanor clutched Thomas's hand so tightly her nails pressed against his skin. Daniel added, "Locals say her spirit lingers in places she once stayed, knocking on doors, asking to be let in. She's searching for shelter, or perhaps for the person she lost. But there's something else. People who see her often feel chosen, as if she's trying to draw them into her unfinished story." The words hung heavy between them. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. When they left the shop, the sun was already dipping toward the horizon. The air grew thicker, charged with the coming night. They walked back in silence, both too troubled to speak. That evening, Eleanor insisted they not return to the guest house, but Thomas argued they could not run from it forever. Reluctantly, she followed him back, her steps dragging as the street lamps flickered to life. Inside, the house was unusually quiet. Most guests were out for the evening, leaving only the creak of the stairs and the faint ticking of a clock. Thomas sat near the window, watching the rain begin to fall again, droplets streaking down the glass. Eleanor paced the room, wringing her hands. As the clock neared midnight, the air seemed to grow heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Then it came again, 3 deliberate knocks. Thomas stood quickly, but this time Eleanor clutched his arm with both hands. "Don't open it," she whispered urgently. "If she wanted to harm us, she already could. But if we let her in—" She trailed off, unable to finish. The voice came, soft and pleading. "Please, I don't know where else to go." Thomas's heart thudded in his chest. He could feel Eleanor trembling beside him. Against his better judgment, he asked through the door, "What do you want from us?" There was silence, then the faintest whisper, "To be remembered." The words sent a shiver through him. Eleanor shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. The knocking stopped. For the rest of the night, they heard only the sound of rain and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. But sleep never came. The following day, Thomas decided he needed to see the river. Eleanor protested, but he insisted, "If this is where it happened, maybe we'll understand." They walked to the banks of the Mississippi as dusk approached. The river was wide and restless, brown water swirling under the bridges. Eleanor stood back, arms wrapped around herself, while Thomas moved closer to the edge. He imagined Margaret standing there, drenched by storm, her voice lost in the wind. He whispered, "Why us?" A sudden chill wrapped around him, colder than the evening air. He turned, half expecting to see her. For a moment, he thought he did, a pale figure in the corner of his eye. But when he blinked, she was gone. That night, back at the guest house, the knocking came earlier. 11 o'clock. This time, it was more insistent, almost desperate. Eleanor pressed herself against the wall, tears welling in her eyes. "She won't stop until we leave, Tom. Can't you see that? She doesn't want us here." Thomas stared at the door, his chest tightening. But deep down, he knew Eleanor was wrong. Margaret did want them there, for a reason they could not yet understand. The knocks grew louder. The voice trembled. "Please, I cannot stay outside." Thomas reached for the handle. Eleanor cried out, "No!" But he pulled it open anyway. Margaret stood there again, her eyes glistening with sorrow, water dripping onto the floor. She looked straight at him, her lips trembling as if she struggled to speak. "You look like him," she whispered. Thomas's breath caught. "Like who?" "My Henry," she said, her voice breaking. "The man I was waiting for. He never came." Eleanor gasped. Margaret reached out a hand, her fingers pale and wet. Thomas felt an icy breeze rush past him, filling the room. Eleanor screamed, pulling him back. But Margaret did not step forward. She only stood there, her eyes locked on Thomas, her expression a mixture of longing and despair. Then, as the clock struck midnight, she vanished once more. Thomas shut the door quickly, leaning against it, his heart racing. Eleanor clutched his arm, sobbing. "She's trying to take you. Don't you see? She thinks you're him." Thomas could not answer, because deep inside, he feared she was right. The nights that followed grew worse. The knocks came earlier, the voice louder. The house seemed colder, darker. Other guests began to complain of strange sounds. Footsteps in empty corridors, windows rattling despite calm weather, mirrors fogging as if breathed upon. Mrs. Landry avoided their questions, but Thomas noticed the way she watched him now. Her eyes filled with unease, as if she too feared Margaret's fixation on him. By the fifth night, Eleanor insisted they leave. Bags were packed, tickets ready, but when they tried to sleep, Margaret's voice filled the room, not just from the door, but from within the walls themselves. "You cannot leave me," she whispered. "Not again." The lamps flickered, the air grew icy, and Thomas realized leaving might not be as simple as walking away. Margaret had found him, and she was not willing to let go. The air in the guest house grew oppressive after that fifth night. Even in the middle of the day, when sunlight streamed through the tall windows and the chatter of other guests echoed faintly, Thomas felt a presence lingering just behind him. Sometimes, when he passed the mirror in the narrow hallway, he thought he saw another reflection behind his own. A pale, dark-haired figure hovering at his shoulder. Eleanor became more fragile with each passing hour. She hardly ate during breakfast, avoided the common lounge, and spent most of her time sitting on the bed with her arms folded tightly around herself. She was terrified, yet determined to leave. On the 6th day, just after noon, Thomas suggested they speak directly to Mrs. Landry one last time. They found her in the small kitchen at the back of the house, her sleeves rolled up as she arranged fresh flowers into a vase. The air smelled faintly of lemons and polish, but her face betrayed unease when she saw them enter. "We are leaving tonight," Eleanor blurted out, her voice trembling. "You should have told us the truth from the beginning. This house is haunted, and we can't stay another night." Mrs. Landry sighed, setting the vase down. For a long moment she seemed to weigh her words. Finally, she lowered her voice. "Margaret does not appear to everyone. Only certain people. I feared if I told you too soon, it would make things worse." "Why me?" Thomas demanded, his jaw tight. "Why does she keep coming to our door? Why not anyone else?" Mrs. Landry's eyes softened, though her tone was grave. "Perhaps because you remind her of what she lost. Spirits cling to the familiar, to echoes of their past. Maybe she sees in you the man she waited for, the man who never came back." Thomas's chest tightened. Eleanor shook her head fiercely. "Then she's confused and dangerous. We need to go." Mrs. Landry looked between them, her lips pressing into a thin line. "If you leave tonight, do not look back. Do not answer her if she follows. Spirits like hers, they can attach themselves to those they choose." The warning echoed in Thomas's mind long after they returned upstairs. He began to doubt whether leaving would make any difference. That evening, they packed their bags carefully. Every sound of the zipper or click of the suitcase loud in the heavy silence. The rain returned at dusk, tapping against the shutters, growing into a steady downpour as the hours passed. Thunder rolled over the city, shaking the fragile glass panes. At 10:30, the knocking came again. 3 slow raps on the wooden door. Eleanor froze where she stood, her suitcase half-packed on the bed. Thomas, against his will, turned toward the sound. "Please," came the voice, softer than before, almost tender. "Don't leave me again." Eleanor grabbed his arm, shaking her head wildly. "Don't listen. She's not alive, Tom. She doesn't belong here." "We do." The knocks came louder now, urgent. The brass handle rattled as if someone pressed against it. Thomas felt his chest tighten with both fear and pity. Margaret's voice carried such sorrow, such aching loneliness, that a part of him longed to open the door and tell her she wasn't forgotten. But Eleanor clung to him, whispering prayers under her breath, tears spilling down her cheeks. Then the lamp flickered, the air turned icy, visible breath rising before them, and the door creaked open on its own. Margaret stood in the threshold, water dripping from her dress, her hair plastered to her pale face, her eyes fixed on Thomas with an intensity that rooted him to the floor. "You're here," she whispered, stepping forward. At last, Eleanor screamed, pulling Thomas backward, but he could not move. His feet felt nailed to the floor, his chest heavy with the weight of her gaze. "You promised me," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "You promised you would come back." "I never promised you anything," Thomas managed to whisper, though his voice shook. Margaret tilted her head. confusion shadowing her expression. Then sorrow washed over her face again. No! But you carry his face, his voice. She reached out her hand. The room grew colder still, frost creeping along the edges of the window glass despite the storm outside. Eleanor hurled the nearest object she could grab, a heavy book, toward Margaret. The sound echoed sharply, but the figure did not flinch. Instead, she turned her gaze to Eleanor, eyes darkening, her voice sharp. He kept me waiting, and now you keep him from me. The lamp shattered, plunging the room into darkness. Thomas grabbed Eleanor's hand and pulled her toward the door, past the apparition. For a moment, he felt ice graze his skin as if he had brushed against frozen water. They bolted down the narrow corridor, their footsteps echoing, the storm outside raging as if in chorus with their panic. They reached the staircase, stumbling down 2 steps at a time. Behind them came the sound of dripping water, each drop loud as though the figure followed closely. When they burst into the lobby, Mrs. Landry was there, clutching a lantern. Her face paled at the sight of them. "You saw her," she whispered. "She was in our room." Thomas gasped. She opened the door herself. Mrs. Landry's lips pressed tightly together. "Then it's too late to pretend. Go now. Don't wait for morning." The storm outside made the streets glisten, water running in streams along the cobblestones. They dragged their suitcases, soaked within moments, their clothes plastered to their bodies. Yet neither of them slowed. They reached the corner, breathless, and for the first time dared to glance back. The guest house loomed dark against the rain, only one window glowing faintly on the 2nd floor. And in that glow, silhouetted against the curtains, stood a woman, her hand pressed to the glass, her head tilted as if watching them. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. Eleanor pulled at him, urging him to keep walking. But even as they turned away, the sound came again, 3 deliberate knocks. Not from the house, not from behind them, but impossibly near, as if carried in the very air around them. The city itself seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor clutched Thomas's arm. "Don't answer. Don't look back." They walked on, the storm swallowing their footsteps. Yet the echo of the knocks lingered, steady, patient, promising that Margaret had not finished with them. And somewhere in the darkened streets of New Orleans, a pale figure drifted unseen, searching still, searching for him. The storm that had once confined us inside that worn-out motel room near Oklahoma City finally faded into memory. The days that followed moved quickly, and what had begun as an accident of circumstance, 2 strangers seeking shelter from chaos, grew into something we could never have planned. When the clouds broke and the sky cleared, we each carried our own truth away from that night. For some, it was simply a story of survival, of making it through a storm. But for me, it was much more. That night carved a permanent mark on my path, reminding me that sometimes fate decides to intervene, altering lives in the most unexpected of places. The motel eventually emptied, its neon sign flickering in the wind, as if trying to hold on to what had happened within its walls. I never returned to that place, yet its memory remained sharper than most. Whenever I passed by the highways of Oklahoma, the echo of rain against thin glass and the hum of silence between 2 people resurfaced in my mind. Perhaps not all stories end with clear conclusions. Some linger quietly in the background, neither forgotten nor resolved, like shadows cast at dusk. The storm gave us shelter, but it also gave us each other, if only for a fleeting moment. And so, The motel became less about crumbling walls or flickering lights, and more about a secret chapter in my life. A reminder that destiny can unfold not in grand stages, but in the smallest of rooms, at the edge of a storm, near a city we barely knew.